Hello, historians. We're going to continue discussing the civil rights movement. We kind of left off after the march in Birmingham, which led to JFK's famous speech where he addressed the nation and talked about moving towards giving everybody an opportunity to be successful in this country. His famous civil rights speech. Obviously, Kennedy is assassinated just a few months after he gives that famous speech. A few other things that happened in 1963 where we see the country changing a little bit. The Academy Award, the Oscar for the Best Actor, went to an African American man for the first time, Sidney Poitier, 1963. This is going to give way to 1964. Freedom Summer is what they call it, where you have many, mostly college students from the North going down to Mississippi, where they are trying to increase black voter registration. Remember, this is still a time period where basically they were not allowing African Americans to vote in the South. And so they're trying to register and get them registered to vote in Mississippi. And of course, there's going to be some backlash to this. The Ku Klux Klan, the police, state and local authorities carried out attacks, violent attacks on these college students that are down there, the Northerners, and also any Southerners that were trying to help with this. Two college students and a local leader were murdered. They were missing and then they were found dead. You can see the picture down there. And a lot of this is being covered on national TV, just like the march in Birmingham. People around the country are seeing this on television, and it's starting to change their opinion of, okay, are we doing the right thing here? This is all going to lead to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. This is going to make it a law that you cannot segregate in public places. It banned any type of employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And it was signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson. You can see here. And so segregation now basically becomes illegal in any public place. In 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he donated his money to other civil rights causes. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson also starts his Great Society program. This program was set to eliminate poverty and racial injustice. Started in 64 and 65. It focused on health, education, and job creation. And as you know, this really never, we did not eliminate poverty. We did not eliminate racial injustice. We are still working on doing that. Some of the programs that it started, though, are still around today. The War on Poverty, 40 programs were created and intended to eliminate poverty by improving living conditions and enabling people to lift themselves out of the cycle of poverty. And one of those programs that would have been created would be like food stamps, and there were some other welfare programs created that have helped millions of people over the years. Education, you kids are benefiting from some of these programs that were started. 60 separate bills were created that provided for new and better equipped classrooms, minority scholarships, and low interest student loans. Some of you will go off to college here in a couple of years, and you will go and get a low interest student loan from the government. Right now, in this pandemic, what they've done in this little recession is you don't have to pay any interest on those loans at the moment if you have them, but that was created in the 60s. Medicare and Medicaid are health insurance guaranteed to every American over 65. And they also created programs to improve the government, clean air and water. National Endowment for Arts and Humanities, created with the philosophy that artists, performers, and writers were priceless part of our heritage and deserve support. Job Corps, providing and enabling skills for young men and women to help get an education. The Head Start program for 4 and 5-year-old children from disadvantaged families gave them a chance to start school on an even basis with other youngsters. And so these were all the programs that, or were some of the programs created by LBJ's Great Society initiative. Cassius Clay, famous boxer, 1964, he wins the heavyweight boxing title. After he wins the title, he changes his name to Muhammad Ali. He joins the Nation of Islam, the same group that Malcolm X had been a part of. When he gets drafted into the Vietnam War, he refuses to go. We've talked about this when we were learning about the Vietnam War, and he doesn't get to fight from 1967 until 1971. Then he wins back his title. This will lead us to 65, the march from Selma to Montgomery. So even though we have the Civil Rights Act that was passed and you can't discriminate in public places, there are still many African Americans that are unable to vote due to different rules and laws, Jim Crow laws, that are passed in the South. And so this march is set up and it's going to be on national TV. People are going to see it. It's going to be led by Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference as they march from Selma, right here, to Montgomery, so across Alabama. And of course, Bull Connor sends out the police and says, don't let them get through. And so you've got the riot police set up, and as these people are trying to peacefully march, they're met with the police. The state troopers are using clubs, tear gas, and whips. Some very iconic photographs taken. And of course, just like the Birmingham marches and other civil rights events, the footage is shown on TV, and people across the country are saying, okay, A, they should be able to vote. B, they shouldn't be getting attacked by the police for just marching peacefully. They're not even blocking traffic. They're just marching alongside the road. When they get to Montgomery, there's Martin Luther King Jr. is there waiting for them. Nearly 50,000 supporters, black and white, met the marchers in Montgomery, where they gathered in front of the state capitol to hear Martin Luther King Jr. and others speak. And I'll have a video link to the march. And because of these efforts, that will lead to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So this follows the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and now it's signed into law by LBJ. And what this act does is it bans the use of literacy tests, the Jim Crow laws we talked about. You can't have anything grandfathered in where you have to pay a poll tax or a fee. And also the government will go in and oversee elections where 50% of blacks were registered, or where less than 50% of blacks are registered. So any area where you got less African Americans living in the community and less than 50% of them are registered, the federal government goes in and takes control and says, we're running this election here. And so we see some important, your important political laws being created. The Civil Rights Act of 64, which ends discrimination and segregation in public places. The Voting Rights Act, which is going to help enforce and allow all people to vote. And then the Civil Rights Act of 1968 prohibited the discrimination in the sale or rental of most housing. It strengthened anti-lynching laws and made it a crime to harm civil rights workers. So 3 very important acts of the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson, when you think of him, he gets remembered mostly for the Vietnam War, but he should be remembered for the Civil Rights Acts as well. He should be remembered for the Great Society. Unfortunately, the Vietnam War really tarnishes his reputation. Some of the poor decisions he made with that war. The Black Panther Party is a civil rights group that is definitely different than what Martin Luther King Jr. and others were preaching with civil disobedience at the time. They were an extremist organization founded in Oakland, California in 1966, and they advocated for the use of violence and guerrilla tactics to overthrow the U.S. government. They said, hey, if we're not going to get equal rights, we're going to fight to get those equal rights, whether we have to use violence. They did help their local communities with food banks and things like that as well, so they did have support from many local groups. They armed themselves and said, we are going to police the police. 1967, Thurgood Marshall, famous NAACP lawyer, Lyndon Johnson promotes him and appoints him to the Supreme Court, and he becomes the first Supreme Court justice, and he serves from 1967 to 1991. Remember, he was part of the Brown versus Board of Education court case back in 1954. And then 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee by a man named James Earl Ray. MLK was down there supporting the sanitation workers who were on strike. Famous photograph. Here's Martin Luther King Jr. after he's been shot. Everybody's kind of pointing, hey, the shots came from up there. Now, just before he was assassinated, he was in Memphis and he gave a very famous speech, his mountaintop speech. And he says, hey, I may not be there when we reach the promised land, but everyone else will. And so that's, probably his second most famous speech behind the I Have a Dream speech. After the assassination, it led to riots in some major cities across the country. A lot of conspiracy theorists believe the government was behind it. And so you can't always believe the conspiracy theorists. So that's kind of it for the 1960s with civil rights. Obviously, there's more that occur later, but these were some of the big signature moments of the civil rights movement. These were some of the major significant people of the civil rights movement. I'll have some videos attached below this that you can look at that will show a little bit more that deal with Selma, I've been to the mountaintop speech, and so on.